Because this is not just the story of Rob Reiner's funeral. It is not just about flowers, speeches, or a memorial yet to be announced. It is about timing. It is about silence. It is about a family trying to mourn while the world watches and judges every move. A week after Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were found dead in their Brentwood home, the public is still waiting. Waiting for details. Waiting for closure. Waiting for a moment that feels appropriate, dignified, and final. But nothing about this story feels neat. Nothing feels finished. And nothing feels easy. Rob Reiner was a man who spent his life crafting endings. Some hopeful, some bittersweet, some unforgettable. He understood pacing. He understood emotion. He understood how to leave an audience with something to hold on to as the credits rolled. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Yet now, the end of his own story refuses to follow any familiar script. Instead of tributes, there are police statements. Instead of eulogies, there are court dates. Instead of a peaceful farewell, there is a question that no one dares to ask out loud, but everyone is thinking. How did it come to this? To the outside world, Rob Reiner was a Hollywood constant. A presence that felt permanent. A voice that had been there for decades, shaping films that became part of people's lives. He was the man behind stories that made audiences laugh, cry, and believe in something bigger than themselves. To his children, he was something else entirely. He was dad. And now, Jake Reiner and Romy Reiner are standing in the wreckage of something no family ever imagined surviving. Their parents are gone. Violently. Suddenly. And in the most devastating twist imaginable, their 32-year-old brother, Nick Reiner, sits behind bars without bail, accused by prosecutors of first-degree murder. Accused. Not convicted. But accused in a way that has already reshaped their lives forever. Can you imagine that kind of grief? Losing both parents at once. Being forced to grieve in public. Knowing that every headline reduces your family to a single word, tragedy. And yet, Jake and Romy spoke anyway. They didn't owe the public anything. Not explanations. Not updates. Not statements crafted carefully enough to survive social media scrutiny. But they chose to speak. First about their pain. Then, days later, about something else entirely. A memorial. Not a funeral announcement with dates and times and locations. Just a promise. A quiet assurance that a ceremony honoring their parents will happen later. Later. That word does a lot of heavy lifting here. Later suggests waiting. Later suggests unresolved matters. Later suggests wounds that are still too raw to touch. In a statement shared with the Los Angeles Times and People on December 22nd, Jake and Romy acknowledged the outpouring of love and support. They thanked people. They expressed gratitude. And then they drew a boundary. They would share information about a memorial service at a later date. No details. No timeline. No promises beyond that. Why? Is it because of grief? Is it because of legal complications? Is it because saying goodbye feels impossible when the story isn't over? Or is it because there is something uniquely painful about honoring two lives while another unfolds inside a courtroom? Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were found dead on December 14th, discovered in their Brentwood, California home. According to the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's preliminary investigation, both died from multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. Cold words. Clinical words. Words that feel completely incompatible with the lives they lived. Within days, authorities arrested Nick Reiner. Prosecutors allege he fatally stabbed his parents. He remains behind bars without bail and is scheduled to be arraigned on January 7th. Those facts alone are enough to shatter any family. But this family exists under a spotlight. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every statement is analyzed for hidden meaning. Every delay invites speculation. Jake and Romy know this. That's why their words are measured. That's why their statements ask not just for privacy, but for compassion and humanity. They are not just grieving. They are managing a narrative they never asked to be part of. In their earlier statement on December 17th, shared with TMZ and People, they described their pain as unimaginable. And that word matters. Unimaginable means there is no framework for it. No reference point. No guidebook. They didn't just lose their parents, they said. They lost their best friends. Let that sink in. Rob and Michelle were not distant figures in their children's lives. They weren't names spoken with formality or reverence alone. They were present. They were involved. They were loved deeply and personally. And now, the very act of remembering them publicly feels complicated. Because how do you celebrate a life when the manner of death dominates every conversation? How do you gather people together to say goodbye when one of the most important people in that story cannot be there, and for reasons too painful to fully articulate? This is why the memorial matters. Not just as an event, but as a symbol. It represents a moment when the family will finally step into the light of shared mourning. A moment when Rob Reiner will be remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived. A moment when Michelle Singer Reiner will be honored not as a victim, but as a partner, a mother, and a force in her own right. But that moment hasn't come yet. And until it does, everything feels suspended. Hollywood has responded, but cautiously. Tributes have surfaced. Memories have been shared. But there is a noticeable restraint. An understanding that this is not a story anyone wants to exploit, and yet cannot look away from. Rob Reiner is also survived by Tracy Reiner, the daughter of his former wife Penny Marshall, whom he adopted. Another layer. Another relationship. Another reminder that families are rarely simple, and grief never moves in straight lines. So here we are. A legendary filmmaker gone. A beloved partner gone. A family fractured. A memorial promised, but postponed. A legal process looming. And a public caught between sympathy and curiosity. This introduction isn't about answers. It's about setting the stage for questions that will only grow heavier as time passes. Who was Rob Reiner when the cameras were off? What kind of life did Michelle Singer Reiner truly lead behind the scenes? How did this family function before everything broke apart? And how does a final goodbye even begin when the story refuses to end? Because before we can understand the funeral that hasn't yet happened, before we can grasp the weight of that eventual memorial, we need to go back. Back to the man the world thought it knew. Back to the life that seemed so full. Back to the family dynamic that few outsiders ever saw. And when we do, one thing will become painfully clear. This tragedy did not begin on December 14th. Who was Rob Reiner before the sirens, before the headlines, before his name became inseparable from a tragedy no one wanted to believe? That question sounds simple. It isn't. Because for decades, Rob Reiner existed in the public imagination as something almost permanent. A fixture. A man whose voice, humor, and storytelling felt woven into the background of American culture. He wasn't just a director. He was familiarity. He was comfort. He was the guy who seemed like he would always be there. And that's exactly why his death feels so destabilizing. Before we talk about funerals and memorials, before we examine grief and silence and postponed goodbyes, we have to understand who Rob Reiner was when the world wasn't watching him through the lens of tragedy. Because the shock isn't only that he's gone. It's that someone who symbolized warmth, laughter, and emotional truth met such a violent and unresolved end. Rob Reiner's story didn't begin in Brentwood. It didn't begin in Hollywood either, at least not in the way people imagine. He was born into entertainment, yes. The son of Carl Reiner, a comedy legend whose influence shaped television comedy itself. For many people, that alone defines Rob Reiner's early narrative. Nepo baby, industry kid, someone who had doors opened before he ever knocked. But that's a shortcut explanation. And shortcuts never tell the full story. Growing up in the shadow of a giant isn't easy, especially when that giant is beloved, brilliant, and constantly in the room. Carl Reiner wasn't just famous. He was revered. And Rob knew early on that admiration could be a double-edged sword. You're expected to be funny. Expected to be talented. Expected to justify your place. And if you fail, people don't just say you weren't good enough. They say you were handed everything and still couldn't measure up. That pressure shapes a person. Rob Reiner didn't initially set out to be a director. In fact, many people first knew him as an actor. A face, a voice, a presence. He became widely recognized for playing Michael "Meathead" Stivic on All in the Family, a role that made him famous but also boxed him in. Meathead was outspoken, liberal, argumentative, a perfect foil to Archie Bunker, and audiences loved it. But success as an actor didn't satisfy Rob Reiner the way storytelling did. He wanted control. He wanted authorship. He wanted to shape the entire emotional journey, not just deliver lines written by someone else. So he stepped behind the camera. And that's where everything changed. Rob Reiner didn't just direct movies. He made cultural landmarks. Films that weren't just watched, but quoted, revisited, passed down. Think about it. How many directors can say their work spans genres and generations the way his does? He made people laugh. He made them cry. He made them believe in love, friendship, justice, and resilience. And he did it without cynicism. That matters. In an industry often accused of being cold or detached, Rob Reiner's work felt human. His stories had heart. Even when they were funny, they weren't cruel. Even when they were dramatic, they weren't hollow. Audiences trusted him. That trust extended beyond the screen. Rob Reiner became known as someone who spoke his mind, especially about politics and social issues. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't quiet. He believed that silence was a choice, and he chose not to be silent. That earned him admiration. It also earned him criticism. But whether people agreed with him or not, they knew where he stood. And in a strange way, that consistency reinforced his image. He was authentic, predictable in the best sense. Someone who didn't suddenly change values when the room changed. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. Because public personas are curated, even the honest ones. Behind closed doors, Rob Reiner was also a husband, a father, and a partner. And that side of his life rarely made headlines. His marriage to Michelle Singer Reiner wasn't flashy. It wasn't tabloid fodder. It didn't dominate red carpets or gossip columns. And that was intentional. Michelle wasn't interested in celebrity for its own sake. She worked in the industry, yes. She was a producer. She collaborated with Rob. But she wasn't chasing the spotlight. Friends described their relationship as steady, grounded, functional in a way that's almost boring by Hollywood standards. And boring, in this case, was a compliment. They were a team, not just creatively, but emotionally. Rob trusted Michelle, relied on her, listened to her. In an industry where egos often dominate, their partnership stood out because it didn't feel performative. They raised children together, built routines, maintained family traditions. And while no family is perfect, there was a sense of stability that surrounded them. That's what makes the shock so profound. Because when tragedy strikes a family that already felt fractured, people nod. They say it makes sense. They talk about warning signs and red flags. But when tragedy strikes a family that appeared solid, supportive, and close, the human brain rebels against it. This isn't supposed to happen here. Rob Reiner wasn't the kind of figure people associate with chaos or volatility. He didn't project darkness. He didn't cultivate mystery. He felt accessible, almost safe. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How much did the public really know? The answer is, not enough. And maybe never could. Because families are ecosystems. They are shaped by dynamics outsiders never see. Patterns that look harmless until, suddenly, they aren't. And that brings us to Rob Reiner as a father. He loved his children deeply. That much is clear from the way Jake and Romy speak about him. They didn't describe him as distant. They didn't describe him as demanding. They described him as their best friend. That doesn't happen by accident. That kind of closeness is built over years of shared time, shared conversations, shared trust, which makes what comes later even harder to comprehend. But before we go there, it's important to pause and recognize something else. Rob Reiner's life wasn't defined solely by his professional success or his public opinions. It was defined by relationships, by loyalty, by consistency. People who worked with him often describe him as someone who remembered names, who checked in, who followed up, someone who cared. Those qualities don't disappear overnight. So when the news broke that Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were found dead in their home, the shock wasn't just about violence. It was about contradiction. This doesn't align with the man we thought we knew. And that dissonance is exactly why the story refuses to settle. Because understanding Rob Reiner as a person is essential to understanding why the family's grief is so complex, why the memorial is delayed, and why the silence feels so heavy. This wasn't just the loss of a public figure. This was the loss of a center. For his children, Rob Reiner wasn't a legend. He was the person who answered the phone, the person who showed up, the person who offered advice, humor, and reassurance. Imagine losing that in an instant. Imagine trying to reconcile decades of warmth with a final chapter written in blood and legal documents. That's the emotional tension running beneath everything Jake and Romy have said so far. It's not just grief. It's disbelief. And disbelief has a way of freezing people in place. Which is why the memorial hasn't happened yet. Which is why the family is asking for patience. Which is why the story feels like it's hovering between past and future, unable to land. Because before there can be closure, there has to be understanding. And before understanding, there has to be context. Rob Reiner wasn't just someone who died. He was someone who lived fully, visibly, and with intention. And that life didn't end quietly. But to understand how it unraveled, we need to shift our focus away from the man himself and toward the person who stood beside him for decades. Because Michelle Singer Reiner wasn't just part of Rob Reiner's life. She was central to it. And her story is where the cracks begin to show. Who was Michelle Singer Reiner? If Rob was the storyteller, Michelle was the quiet force behind the scenes, shaping narratives, smoothing edges, and holding the family together in ways most people never saw. She didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't crave applause. Yet her influence ran through every aspect of their lives, professionally and personally. Michelle's work as a producer often went unnoticed by the public. Her name might not appear in flashy headlines, but her fingerprints were on the projects that mattered most to Rob. Friends and collaborators described her as meticulous, thoughtful, and endlessly patient. The kind of person who could balance a creative, temperamental genius like Rob without ever diminishing him. She complemented his intensity with calm. She matched his vision with grounded realism. Together, they were a team that functioned seamlessly, at least outwardly. But behind the stability, as with all families, there were nuances. Their marriage, like most, had its quiet struggles. Maintaining privacy in Hollywood is a feat in itself, but doing so while raising 3 children and managing an empire of creative projects requires a delicate choreography. Michelle's skill at keeping the family life steady while the outside world buzzed with speculation and gossip was extraordinary. Their children, Jake, Romy, and Nick, benefited from this stability, even if it was invisible to outsiders. Jake and Romy would later describe their parents as their best friends, a testament to Michelle's nurturing presence as much as Rob's. They weren't distant authority figures. They were participants in daily life, confidants, and supporters. The family dinners, shared vacations, and quiet conversations built a network of trust and love that seemed untouchable. Yet, the circumstances surrounding their deaths expose how fragile even the most seemingly secure family dynamics can be. A single moment of violence can unravel decades of care, love, and routine. Michelle's role as a stabilizer, the person who often mediated tensions and held the household together, could not prevent the unthinkable from occurring. On December 14th, the world learned that the people who anchored a family and a career were gone. Not just gone, but taken violently, in a way that defies reason. Michelle's death, alongside Rob's, shocked Hollywood, fans, and friends alike. It wasn't just the loss of a talented producer or the spouse of a famous director. It was the loss of a mother, a mentor, a quiet force who kept an entire household afloat. The immediate aftermath of their deaths was chaotic. Law enforcement moved quickly, investigating the scene, collecting evidence, and trying to understand how a tragedy of this magnitude could occur. The preliminary findings were horrifying. Both Rob and Michelle had died from multiple sharp force injuries. The medical examiner ruled their deaths a homicide. In legal terms, the facts were clear. In emotional terms, they were incomprehensible. Then came the arrest of Nick Reiner, the couple's youngest child. Allegedly, he was responsible for fatally stabbing his parents. The accusation alone introduces a level of complexity and tragedy that words struggle to convey. Families are complicated, yes, but this is unthinkable. How does a family move forward when the suspected perpetrator is not an outsider, but a son? For Jake and Romy, the situation was devastating. They had to navigate grief that was both intensely personal and public. Their parents were gone, and the circumstances forced them into the glare of media attention. Every statement, every social media post, every interview was dissected and analyzed. There was no room for private mourning in the traditional sense. Yet, despite the unimaginable pain, they chose to speak. On December 17th, just 3 days after the deaths, they released a statement acknowledging the unimaginable pain of losing Rob and Michelle. They emphasized the need for compassion and humanity, urging the public to temper speculation with kindness. This request, seemingly simple, highlights the emotional tightrope they were forced to walk, balancing public interest with private grief. But there was more. A week later, on December 22nd, they released another statement regarding the memorial service. Information about the service would be forthcoming, they said. The decision to delay sharing details reflects the tension inherent in this tragedy. How do you plan a ceremony for loved ones when part of the family is absent, in custody, facing serious charges? How do you balance grief with legal considerations, with personal safety, with emotional readiness? This postponement, while understandable, adds another layer to the story. The world wants closure, but closure may not be possible, not yet. The memorial service, a moment designed for remembrance, healing, and farewells, remains undefined. It exists in the future, a placeholder for grief and reflection that cannot be fully realized in the present. Michelle's absence in public narratives is particularly striking. She was never seeking fame, yet now her life, work, and death are under intense scrutiny. Fans and media alike are piecing together the story of her life through statements, obituaries, and second-hand accounts. There's an irony here. Someone who lived quietly, who facilitated others' creativity, is now the subject of a story larger than life itself. And still, for the children, the grief is intensely private. They remember Michelle not as a headline, but as a mother. Someone who read bedtime stories, cooked meals, mediated arguments, and provided unconditional love. These memories are theirs alone, yet the public cannot help but intrude, seeking details, context, and answers. Every family has secrets, tensions, and hidden dynamics. Few outsiders, no matter how close, can truly understand the interior life of another family. In this case, that truth is magnified. How did the dynamics between Michelle, Rob, and their children evolve over the years? What pressures existed behind closed doors? What conflicts were resolved quietly, and which ones festered? The answers are impossible to know fully. But one thing is clear. Michelle's role as a stabilizer, protector, and emotional anchor was profound. Losing her meant losing the person who kept the family's emotional ecosystem in balance. Losing Rob at the same time magnified that absence exponentially. And now, as the world waits for details of a memorial service, the story shifts to anticipation. It shifts to the unknown. It shifts to a question that hangs over every statement, every planning session, every interaction. How do you honor two lives so central to a family when the circumstances of their deaths are so traumatic, so violent, and so unresolved? The delayed memorial becomes a symbol, not just of loss, but of waiting, of patience, of the liminal space between grief and closure. It is a moment that cannot be rushed, cannot be forced, and cannot yet be fully understood. And within that delay exists tension. Tension between public curiosity and private mourning, between justice and remembrance, between what is appropriate to share and what must remain sacred. This is the world Jake and Romy inhabit now, a world where grief is public and controlled, where pain is shared selectively, and where every word carries weight. They must navigate this world while processing the unthinkable, losing both parents violently and living under the shadow of suspicion cast over a sibling. Michelle's story, Rob's story, and the family's story are intertwined. Their lives, their love, and their deaths create a narrative that is both extraordinary and tragic. And while the public sees headlines, the children see memories. They see meals, vacations, late-night conversations, and the quiet moments that define their childhood. But those memories exist alongside horror, alongside disbelief, alongside legal proceedings that complicate mourning. And that is the tension that drives everything forward. Because no one can move past this quickly. No one can write a final chapter until the family is ready, until justice moves forward, until grief has its space, until the memorial service finally happens. And that brings us to the next piece of this story, the children themselves. How do Jake, Romy, and Nick navigate this complex terrain? How do they process the unimaginable? How do they manage being thrust into a public spotlight while their private world collapses? Because understanding the family is essential to understanding the memorial, the grief, and the legacy of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Jake, Romy, and Nick Reiner. 3 siblings. 3 lives entwined by blood, upbringing, and the unshakable shadow of a Hollywood dynasty. And yet, as December 14th descended into horror, those shared bonds were suddenly fractured in a way that no family could anticipate. Jake Reiner, the eldest, had always been described by friends as thoughtful, grounded, and pragmatic. He was the one often seen managing logistics, taking care of details behind the scenes, and ensuring that family projects, whether creative or personal, ran smoothly. To outsiders, Jake may have seemed like the responsible sibling, the steady hand in the trio. But responsibility does not inoculate one against grief, especially grief layered with shock, betrayal, and incomprehension. Romy Reiner, the middle child, carried a more private demeanor. She was known to be reflective, articulate, and emotionally perceptive. In public statements following their parents' deaths, Romy's voice conveyed a depth of sorrow and resilience. Her words revealed someone navigating the impossible, loving her parents, grieving them deeply, and attempting to protect the family legacy while under immense scrutiny. Romy's presence in the family narrative represents emotional continuity, a link to the love and life that existed before tragedy struck. Then there is Nick Reiner, the youngest, whose alleged involvement in their parents' deaths casts a long, dark shadow over everything. Nick's story is complex, filled with public speculation and private grief that the family has not disclosed. His arrest for the alleged homicide of Rob and Michelle Reiner is more than a legal event. It is an emotional earthquake shaking the foundations of familial bonds. Questions abound. How did a relationship deteriorate to this point? What were the warning signs? What remained invisible to those who loved him? For Jake and Romy, processing this event means navigating grief while contending with the incomprehensible. Their public statements, measured and deliberate, are attempts to reconcile personal devastation with the scrutiny of the world. In their December 17th statement, they described their pain as unimaginable, a phrase that, while simple, conveys depths of sorrow that words can scarcely capture. They asked for privacy, for compassion, and for humanity in a situation where the world's curiosity could easily overshadow their mourning. The siblings' dynamic is now irrevocably altered. Where once there may have been disagreements typical of any family, now there is a chasm carved by trauma, legal proceedings, and public scrutiny. Jake and Romy must contend with not only the loss of their parents, but also the reality that their brother is suspected of perpetrating the violence. That duality, grief and conflict, is a psychological landscape most people cannot imagine navigating. This tension extends into the question of memory and legacy. How do they honor their parents' lives while grappling with the actions of their youngest sibling? How do they plan a memorial when part of the family is legally constrained and emotionally compromised? And how do they continue to live in the shadow of this tragedy while the world watches every step? These questions underscore a broader reality. Families are never simple. They are networks of love, obligation, loyalty, disappointment, and unpredictability. And when a tragedy occurs, it exposes all of these threads simultaneously, leaving no single narrative intact. In the Reiner family, the threads of love and violence, devotion and suspicion, public attention and private sorrow intertwine in a way that defies resolution. Jake and Romy's public statements serve multiple functions. They are a shield, protecting the family's privacy and requesting respect. They are a bridge, connecting the public's understanding to the reality of private grief. And they are a marker, establishing a narrative of humanity amidst chaos. These statements are carefully calibrated, balancing transparency with discretion. They acknowledge pain without casting blame publicly, demonstrate vulnerability without surrendering control, and maintain dignity while facing a story that is far from dignified. Nick's absence from these statements, and from the forthcoming memorial, is significant. It represents both legal necessity and emotional reality. His inability to participate in mourning physically, emotionally, or publicly alters the family's experience of grief. The family must navigate rituals of remembrance while missing a critical member, which inevitably shapes the memorial's tone, timing, and structure. This triad of sibling experience, Jake's responsibility, Romy's emotional acuity, and Nick's legal absence, creates a framework for understanding the family's current state. It frames their interactions, their decisions, and their expressions of grief. It also provides context for why the memorial service has been delayed, why the family has chosen measured statements, and why they are navigating a path between public curiosity and private mourning with extreme caution. The children's perspective also illuminates the paradox of public grief. While the world consumes headlines, social media posts, and news reports, the lived experience of sorrow remains deeply personal. Jake and Romy are forced to live with their parents' absence, the allegations surrounding their brother, and the pressure of being representatives of the family's narrative. They cannot separate their private mourning from public perception. Every action carries symbolic weight. Their experience highlights a broader truth. Tragedy does not only impact those directly involved in a violent event. It reverberates outward, affecting relationships, public perception, and the legacy of the deceased. In this case, the Reiner children must manage grief, familial conflict, and societal expectations simultaneously, a task that is both unprecedented and excruciating. In understanding the Reiner children, one also understands the emotional architecture of the memorial itself. The service, when it occurs, will not simply commemorate Rob and Michelle's lives. It will also reflect the fractures, absences, and tensions that define the current family dynamic. It will be a space where love and loss collide, where public celebration and private sorrow coexist uneasily, and where the family attempts to reconcile the past with an uncertain future. This chapter in their lives, defined by unimaginable loss and complex emotional landscapes, sets the stage for what comes next. Planning a memorial under circumstances that challenge conventional mourning. It is here that the story of Rob and Michelle Reiner's final goodbye becomes not just about the deceased, but about the living, those tasked with honoring memories while navigating a present defined by grief, absence, and the weight of unresolved questions. And just when it seems that the family's grief might settle into a rhythm, the legal shadow of Nick's alleged involvement looms ever larger, threatening to dominate public attention and internal family dynamics. How does one reconcile the desire to honor life with the presence of suspected violence perpetrated by someone so intimately connected? How do you reconcile mourning with the inescapable reality of ongoing investigations? The answers are unclear. The journey is ongoing. And the questions are far from over. December 14th was a day that no one in the Reiner family, or in the world watching from the outside, would ever forget. The day began like any other in Brentwood, California, with a quiet sense of routine. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. The air was calm, and the household seemed, as it always had, orderly and grounded. But within hours, that calm was shattered in a way that would reverberate through Hollywood and beyond. The discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies sent shockwaves not only through their immediate circle, but across the entertainment world. A home that had been a sanctuary became a crime scene almost instantly. Law enforcement cordoned off the property, evidence teams arrived, and the narrative shifted from celebration of life to investigation of death. Headlines screamed of tragedy, speculation filled the air, and the public's curiosity clashed with the family's need for privacy. The preliminary investigation by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner revealed multiple sharp force injuries on both Rob and Michelle. The manner of death was determined to be homicide, a term that is clinical and precise, but carries a weight almost impossible to convey. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural causes. This was intentional, violent, and incomprehensible to anyone who had known them personally or admired them professionally. In the days immediately following the discovery, authorities moved swiftly. The initial investigation focused on understanding what had occurred, how it had occurred, and whether there were any suspects. Every moment was crucial, every piece of evidence meticulously collected. And then, as the investigation progressed, a name emerged that shocked the public: Nick Reiner. Nick, the youngest child of Rob and Michelle, was arrested and charged with the alleged homicides. The charges were staggering. First-degree murder, according to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The allegations alone created a narrative that was almost unbearable. Families are complicated, yes, but rarely do they collide with public scrutiny in such a devastatingly specific way. A son accused of murdering his own parents is not a storyline most of us are prepared to process. The arrest added an additional layer of complexity and pain for Jake and Romy Reiner. Their grief was no longer just about losing their parents. It was intertwined with fear, confusion, and the struggle to reconcile love for a sibling with the alleged reality of his actions. The psychological weight of such circumstances is almost impossible to articulate. How do you navigate mourning when the perpetrator of the loss is someone you love? How do you preserve family loyalty while acknowledging justice? As news of Nick's arrest became public, media outlets quickly converged on every detail, speculation, and rumor. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to disbelief, and the Reiner children found themselves thrust into a spotlight they could not escape. Every statement they released was analyzed. Every silence was interpreted. Every word from their past, whether in interviews or public appearances, was suddenly scrutinized for hidden meaning. Yet, despite the public pressure and the raw, unimaginable grief, Jake and Romy spoke. Their statements were carefully measured but emotionally resonant. On December 17th, they described their loss as unimaginable, emphasizing the depth of their sorrow and the intensity of their pain. They highlighted the need for compassion and humanity, asking the public to temper speculation with kindness. This was not just a plea. It was an assertion of agency in a situation where so much had already been taken from them. In those statements, they made something very clear. Their parents were not only influential public figures, but deeply loved, irreplaceable family members. Rob and Michelle were described not simply as parents, but as best friends, mentors, and anchors in the lives of their children. This distinction is vital. The public sees headlines. The family remembers dinners, quiet conversations, laughter, and guidance. The personal, lived experience of Rob and Michelle is immeasurably richer than any media narrative. Even as Jake and Romy spoke, the shadow of Nick's alleged actions loomed over every word. Their grief could not exist in isolation from the legal realities their family faced. Nick remained in custody without bail, and his arraignment was scheduled for January 7th. The children were forced to navigate a world in which mourning and legal strategy, love and suspicion, coexist simultaneously, a tightrope of emotion, judgment, and societal expectation that few could ever fully understand. This duality, personal loss juxtaposed against legal complications, also delayed the memorial service for their parents. On December 22nd, Jake and Romy issued another statement, acknowledging the outpouring of support from the public while announcing that information about a memorial service would be forthcoming. The use of the word forthcoming signals both intent and restraint. They are honoring their parents' memory, but on terms dictated by emotional readiness, legal necessity, and familial stability. The memorial exists as a promise, a placeholder for grief that cannot yet be fully expressed. The delay also reflects a deeper tension. How do you publicly commemorate a life when part of the family cannot participate? How do you create closure when justice remains unresolved? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the lived reality for Jake and Romy, whose grief is intertwined with both the absence of their parents and the absence of their youngest sibling in the very rituals designed to honor family bonds. Beyond the immediate family, Rob and Michelle's extended family also feels the impact. Tracy Reiner, adopted by Rob and previously Penny Marshall's daughter, is another crucial presence in the narrative. Her connection to the family adds layers of love, complexity, and shared grief. She represents both continuity and memory, bridging generations and maintaining ties to the life and legacy of Rob and Michelle. The cumulative effect of these events. The violent loss of parents, the legal entanglements surrounding a sibling, and the public scrutiny creates a landscape of grief that is both private and inescapably public. It underscores the complexity of mourning in the modern world, where every personal tragedy is amplified by media, social networks, and societal curiosity. For the Reiner children, there is no simple path to healing. Each decision, each statement, each action carries weight, consequence, and scrutiny. And yet, in this chaos, there is a determination. Jake and Romy are asserting their agency, claiming space to honor their parents, and attempting to preserve dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Their measured statements, their insistence on privacy, and their attention to the forthcoming memorial reflect resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence. They are navigating a terrain that balances grief, love, justice, and public expectation. The memorial, when it finally occurs, will be more than a ceremony. It will be a convergence of grief, memory, and unresolved tension. It will be a place where the public and private intersect, where the story of Rob and Michelle Reiner's lives is celebrated, and where the family attempts to reclaim some measure of control over a narrative that has been dominated by tragedy. But even as plans are made, even as friends and colleagues prepare tributes, and even as fans reflect on the legacy of two extraordinary lives, one question remains inescapable. How does a family reconcile love and loss with betrayal, suspicion, and public scrutiny? How does mourning coexist with the shadow of unresolved justice? The answers are elusive. The path forward is uncertain. And yet, it is within this tension, this space between grief and public observation, that the true weight of the Reiner family's tragedy becomes clear. Hollywood mourns differently. Grief in the public eye is not private. It's amplified, scrutinized, dissected. And in the case of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the scrutiny was impossible to escape. From the moment news broke of their deaths on December 14th, every corner of the entertainment world was watching, sharing, and reacting. Friends, colleagues, and fans expressed sorrow. Social media lit up with tributes. Articles recounted Rob's career, Michelle's contributions, and the couple's combined impact on Hollywood and beyond. But beneath the headlines, a more intimate, complex story was unfolding, a story of family, love, trauma, and the difficult intersection of public life and private tragedy. The response from Hollywood insiders was revealing. Directors, producers, and actors who had worked closely with Rob Reiner offered statements highlighting his generosity, humor, and professionalism. They spoke of his loyalty, his attention to detail, and his unwavering commitment to telling stories that mattered. Michelle's role as a stabilizing force and creative partner was equally praised. She had managed projects, supported talent, and facilitated collaboration, often quietly, but effectively. Yet, there was a conscious restraint in many of these responses. Hollywood is a world of access, but it is also a world aware of optics. The deaths were violent, the circumstances tragic, and the involvement of Nick Reiner introduced a legal dimension that complicated public expressions of grief. Colleagues offered condolences carefully, balancing respect for the family's privacy with acknowledgement of their loss. Some refrained from public commentary entirely, a silent tribute in its own right. The public response added another layer. Fans flooded social media with memories of Rob's films, some humorous, some poignant. When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, films that had shaped the childhoods, adolescence, and adulthood of generations. Each post was an attempt to process grief through shared cultural touchstones. And yet, the undercurrent of the story, the violent deaths and the legal situation surrounding Nick, added tension and discomfort to even the most heartfelt tributes. For Jake and Romy, navigating this dual reality, public interest and private grief, was extraordinarily difficult. They had to filter their emotions through the lens of public consumption. Every statement risked misinterpretation. Every public appearance risked intrusion. Their desire for privacy conflicted with the public's need for closure and understanding. And in this tension, grief itself became a layered, complicated experience. The delay of the memorial service underscores this complexity. Scheduled or not, the memorial cannot be separated from the surrounding context. Legal proceedings, public scrutiny, and unresolved trauma. The announcement on December 22nd emphasized that details would be forthcoming, signaling both intent and necessity for caution. Planning a memorial under such conditions requires sensitivity, negotiation, and emotional fortitude. Beyond logistics, the memorial will also have symbolic weight. It will serve as a tangible act of remembrance, an acknowledgement of loss, and a space for collective mourning. It will attempt to reclaim a narrative dominated by tragedy, redirecting focus toward the lives Rob and Michelle lived rather than solely their violent deaths. But the presence, or absence, of family members will shape the ceremony in profound ways. Nick's inability to participate adds an undeniable emotional and ethical complexity. Friends and extended family also play a role in this dynamic. Tracy Reiner, Rob's adopted daughter from his marriage to Penny Marshall, carries forward a part of the family's legacy and provides additional emotional support to Jake and Romy. Her presence emphasizes the continuity of memory, bridging generations and reminding attendees that family extends beyond immediate biological connections. The intersection of grief and public observation is particularly striking in cases like this. Hollywood is a culture of performance, where appearances are meticulously curated, and personal life often exists as a narrative commodity. Grief, in this context, becomes performative by necessity, an experience shaped not only by emotion but by perception. For Jake and Romy, negotiating authenticity in their mourning while managing external expectations adds another layer of emotional strain. In addition to emotional challenges, logistical and legal considerations shape the memorial. Authorities' ongoing investigation, the arraignment of Nick Reiner, and potential media coverage all inform decisions regarding timing, location, and guest lists. The family must navigate a space where honoring the dead intersects with legal strategy and public attention. These constraints underscore the tension between private mourning and public ceremony, creating a memorial that is both necessary and fraught with complexity. Amidst this backdrop, the Reiner children's public statements serve as a framework for understanding the family's approach to grief. By emphasizing compassion, humanity, and privacy, they attempt to assert control over a narrative dominated by tragedy and speculation. They are not only grieving but also mediating the story told to the public. Their words are carefully calibrated to maintain dignity, protect loved ones, and acknowledge the depth of loss while resisting the sensationalism that often accompanies high-profile tragedies. The role of memory in this process is crucial. While headlines focus on death, the family remembers life, moments of humor, guidance, shared experiences, and emotional intimacy. These memories serve as both comfort and responsibility, shaping how the memorial will be conducted and how the family intends to honor Rob and Michelle's legacy. Balancing these private recollections with public expectation is a delicate, ongoing process. Finally, the broader societal context cannot be ignored. High-profile tragedies like this one illuminate tensions between public interest, media ethics, and family rights. The Reiner case highlights the challenges families face when grief becomes a spectacle, when personal tragedy intersects with legal scrutiny, and when private mourning is subjected to public consumption. And yet, through all of this, the family seeks to preserve something sacred, the memory of Rob and Michelle as people, not just as headlines. They are navigating grief, planning a memorial, and managing public expectation while holding onto the essence of the lives that were lost. But even as tributes are shared and memories recounted, the shadow of unresolved questions looms. The memorial will come, but it cannot erase the pain. It cannot fully reconcile love with alleged violence. It cannot erase the absence of parents or the complexity introduced by their youngest child. As the days turned into weeks after December 14th, the Reiner family found themselves navigating an emotional and logistical labyrinth that few could ever anticipate. The immediate shock of losing Rob and Michelle was only the beginning. Layered on top of grief was the public's insatiable curiosity, the ongoing legal investigation, and the question of how to honor two lives so central to the family without exacerbating the pain. Jake and Romy Reiner, in particular, bore the dual burden of mourning and mediation. They were the spokespeople for the family, tasked with communicating sorrow without compromising dignity, sharing information without sensationalizing tragedy, and responding to public interest while maintaining privacy. Their December 17th and December 22nd statements reflected this delicate balancing act, offering glimpses into their pain while asserting boundaries. Yet, private grief and public responsibility are not the only challenges. The memorial service itself, though promised, presented a unique set of complications. Planning a ceremony under ordinary circumstances is already a sensitive endeavor. Planning it in the wake of a violent, highly publicized death, with a key family member unable to attend, is exponentially more complex. Every decision, from the guest list to the location, the speakers, and the tone of the service, carries emotional and symbolic weight. The family faces a particularly poignant dilemma: how to honor Rob and Michelle as a couple, as parents, and as individuals, while acknowledging the fractured reality of the family. Their children must decide how to structure the memorial so that it reflects the love and life of their parents without ignoring the current, painful circumstances. How do you craft a narrative of celebration when your grief is so raw, and when one sibling is absent under circumstances that are both tragic and legally charged? Hollywood's response to this situation provides an additional layer of insight. Colleagues and friends have publicly expressed condolences, emphasizing Rob's legendary career and Michelle's often understated contributions. Yet there has been a conscious restraint in many statements, likely due to the sensitive legal circumstances. Public figures have praised the couple's impact, not just on film, but on those who knew them personally. They highlight Rob's generosity, mentorship, and dedication to storytelling, as well as Michelle's ability to facilitate collaboration and support creativity quietly yet powerfully. These tributes, while heartfelt, cannot replace the private mourning of the family. Jake and Romy must navigate the tension between honoring public perception and preserving the intimate truths of their parents' lives. Every anecdote shared, every memory recounted, is filtered through both love and trauma. It is a constant negotiation of authenticity versus public expectation, of grief versus performance. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner's legal situation looms as an ever-present backdrop. His arrest and pending arraignment complicate every aspect of family mourning. The memorial, while a tribute to life, cannot fully exist in a vacuum. It is inherently connected to unresolved questions of justice and accountability. The family must consider how to create a space that honors their parents without overshadowing the truth of the allegations or compromising their own emotional safety. The timing of the memorial is also significant. A rushed ceremony could fail to capture the depth of emotion or allow for proper reflection. A delayed service allows for planning, coordination, and careful attention to emotional readiness. But delays also heighten anticipation, public curiosity, and speculation. The family is forced to balance their needs with those of the broader world watching intently. Memory plays a central role in this process. The Reiner children, in interviews and statements, have emphasized that their parents were not just public figures. They were loving, engaged, and present in their lives. Rob and Michelle were described as best friends to their children, highlighting the intimate, emotional layers of family life that are invisible to the public. These private memories will inevitably shape the memorial, influencing speeches, tributes, and rituals. In addition to family and professional colleagues, friends, neighbors, and the community also contribute to the narrative of remembrance. They provide anecdotes, share stories, and help contextualize the lives that were lost. This broader network of support reflects the impact Rob and Michelle had on those around them, emphasizing that their lives extended beyond immediate family and Hollywood circles. At the same time, the family must navigate the ethical considerations of public mourning. High-profile deaths often invite speculation, conspiracy theories, and intrusive questioning. Jake and Romy's public statements underscore their desire to maintain dignity and compassion amidst scrutiny, asking for humanity in the face of curiosity. The family's insistence on privacy is not merely about secrecy. It is a strategy for preserving emotional integrity while managing a narrative that is otherwise dominated by tragedy. The combination of grief, legal complexity, public attention, and logistical challenges creates a unique emotional landscape. It is a space where mourning cannot be linear, where closure is postponed, and where every step carries significant consequences. The Reiner children must operate within this landscape, navigating conflicting demands while seeking to honor their parents authentically. And so, as the memorial remains in planning, the world waits. Friends, colleagues, and fans anticipate a ceremony that will provide closure and honor. The family anticipates a space where memories can be shared safely and love can be acknowledged fully. But the tension between expectation and reality remains palpable. The question now is not just what the memorial will look like, but how the family will reconcile the grief, loss, and unresolved legal matters that accompany it. How do you say goodbye when part of the story remains unresolved, when questions linger, and when the shadows of tragedy cannot be entirely lifted? The answers are still unfolding. The memorial has yet to occur, and the Reiner family continues to navigate a path that is both deeply personal and undeniably public. The anticipation surrounding the memorial service for Rob and Michelle Reiner is about more than just a date on a calendar. It is about reclaiming a narrative, asserting dignity, and creating a space for remembrance that transcends the headlines. For Jake and Romy, this service is not just ceremonial. It is therapeutic, symbolic, and profoundly personal. Every decision they make in planning it carries emotional, logistical, and ethical weight. Choosing the location is the first major consideration. It must accommodate family, friends, and colleagues, yet maintain privacy from media scrutiny. It must reflect the personalities of Rob and Michelle, honoring their contributions, their passions, and the lives they led. Whether indoors or outdoors, in a chapel or a private estate, the space will be curated to evoke warmth, intimacy, and respect, a counterpoint to the violence that abruptly ended their lives. The timing of the service is equally critical. A memorial cannot be rushed. Jake and Romy must ensure that participants are emotionally ready, that legal constraints are respected, and that the ceremony can honor the complexity of their parents' lives. Delaying the memorial is not avoidance. It is intentional, thoughtful, and necessary for authentic remembrance. The passage of time allows the family to prepare emotionally, coordinate tributes, and construct a narrative that is both truthful and healing. Guest lists pose another layer of complexity. Beyond immediate family, colleagues from decades of work in Hollywood will likely attend. Friends, mentors, and collaborators will want to pay tribute. But there is also a delicate balance. The family must protect emotional boundaries while allowing space for genuine expressions of love and respect. Deciding who speaks, what stories are shared, and how the ceremony unfolds requires strategic foresight, empathy, and sensitivity. Speeches and tributes are central to the memorial. These moments allow attendees to articulate memories, convey emotions, and honor the unique qualities of Rob and Michelle. They provide a structured space for grief while also reinforcing the public perception of the couple as loving, generous, and impactful. Stories of mentorship, humor, creativity, and kindness will highlight the lives they lived, rather than the manner of their deaths. These tributes will help shift focus from tragedy to legacy, from loss to remembrance. Symbolism within the ceremony is another important consideration. Every choice, the music, flowers, photographs, and readings, will convey meaning. The Reiner children may choose elements that reflect their parents' personalities, Rob's humor and warmth, Michelle's calm strength and dedication. These details transform the memorial from a standard service into a deeply personal reflection of life, love, and family. The presence, or absence, of Nick Reiner is an undeniable factor. While he remains in custody and unable to attend, the family must navigate the implications of his absence. The memorial cannot ignore the reality of his situation, yet it must focus on celebrating life rather than dwelling on unresolved legal matters. This balance is delicate. It requires acknowledgement without allowing the circumstances to overshadow the ceremony's purpose. Media management is a crucial consideration. In high-profile cases, media intrusion can compromise privacy and emotional safety. Jake and Romy must establish boundaries, determine what is publicly disclosed, and protect the sanctity of the event. This involves coordination with public relations teams, security personnel, and possibly legal advisors, ensuring that the memorial remains a space for genuine mourning rather than spectacle. The emotional architecture of the service is equally vital. Mourners will experience a spectrum of emotions: sadness, reflection, relief, gratitude, and love. The ceremony must accommodate these feelings, providing structure while allowing space for raw emotion. Moments of silence, shared stories, and private reflection will create an environment where grief is acknowledged and communal support is reinforced. Logistical considerations extend beyond the event itself. Accommodating attendees, ensuring accessibility, and coordinating timing all contribute to the memorial's effectiveness. Security, privacy, and comfort are paramount, particularly given the family's need for controlled interaction with media and the public. These details, while practical, directly impact the emotional experience of the ceremony. At the heart of the memorial is the question of legacy. How do you honor two lives so impactful, so intertwined with the cultural and emotional fabric of a community, while acknowledging the complexity of their deaths? For Jake and Romy, the answer lies in storytelling. Sharing memories, highlighting contributions, and creating a space where love, humor, and warmth dominate over violence and speculation. The ceremony also represents a turning point in public grief. For fans and colleagues, it is a chance to pay respects, celebrate life, and gain closure. For the family, it is an opportunity to reclaim narrative control, honor their parents authentically, and begin the process of emotional reconciliation. The memorial will not erase pain, but it can provide structure, recognition, and a shared space for mourning. In planning this memorial, the Reiner children confront the intersection of personal grief, public expectation, and legal reality. They must negotiate between what is private and what is public, between honoring life and acknowledging tragedy, between emotional truth and narrative control. Each choice reflects the delicate balancing act required to navigate mourning in a high-profile, complex situation. And through it all, the focus remains on Rob and Michelle. Their humor, their creativity, their love, and their commitment to family will be at the center. The memorial will serve as a testament to the lives they led, the impact they had, and the people they were beyond public perception. It is a space for healing, reflection, and remembrance. A structured farewell that preserves dignity, celebrates life, and honors memory. But even as plans are carefully laid, questions linger. How will the public respond? How will the media interpret every decision? How will the family navigate the emotional challenges of bringing together so many layers of grief, love, and loss?